I also think one thing that's really interesting that you pointed out is the fact that PACs were started by labor and taken over by the business class. And I think it's really indicative of this dynamic that you point out that is sort of threefold. You have the peculiarity of the primary system in the US, you have the weakness of both political parties and the party system because of that. And then you have the incoherent business class kind of entering into this dynamic. And this ran counter to my kind of, folk theory of the political workings in America, to be honest. I felt like business was much more cohesive. They had a strict agenda, there was a strategy. What you've kind of uncovered is that they are at odds with each other. So the way that they're enacting certain things can sometimes run counter to other capital interests. And I think that creates a kind of incoherence as a citizen when you start to really look at these things and try to understand your place and the effects that it has on you. But what you've shown is that it's also radicalized the Republican Party, that it's part of this dynamic pulling them to the right. You say, quote, "This group is then split between capitalists who are pursuing extremely conservative policy ends and a group that rejects transactional politics in favor of an all-out war on regulation and the welfare state." So can you talk about that dynamic, the kind of incoherent, incohesive business lobby, the way that PACs inform that, and the outcome of this in American politics?
Yeah, so American capitalism is unique in that there is no acknowledged nationwide peak organization of American business. Right? There's no group that's like the main business organization in the United States. There's like the Chamber of Commerce, which represents a lot of businesses. There's the Business Roundtable, which speaks for like the CEOs of the largest corporations. But there's no just like one business organization that like presents the face of business in politics in the country. And that's unusual if you look at other advanced capitalist nations. And the reason for that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the weakness of American labor and the dominance of American business. If you are dominant, you don't need to be organized, right? Like organizing is something you do to get power. It's not something you do when you already have power. And so like in the United States, the earliest important business organizations were the National Association of Manufacturers and the Chamber of Commerce. And both of them were actually started by politicians for their own ends rather than business organizing to attain power. So the National Association of Manufacturers was started by Republicans allied with the McKinley campaign in 1896 who like wanted to facilitate basically getting all of American business behind McKinley, right? It wasn't business itself organizing, it was politicians being like, wouldn't it be great if business were organized and could do this for us, right? Similarly, the Chamber of Commerce is organized in the 1910s by the I think it's the Taft administration, who were like, look, we're getting some like different signals from business. It would be great if there were one business organization that could just tell us what business wants. And so that's again really unique in the history of capitalism, that business organization comes completely from outside of business itself. And as a result of this kind of disorganized character of American business, business in the United States has always been kind of more suspicious, less amenable to compromise, more aggressive towards labor, because there's kind of no one organization being like, okay, are we all together on this? Or, it's more like, if a strike wins in one factory, that means that it's immediately to the competitive disadvantage of another factor or of that factory versus other factories in the sector, versus if you have a sector-wide thing, then it's imposed on all capitalists at once. So that's a long-running feature of American business. Now, in the 1970s, it must be said, American business actually did organize in a fairly impressive manner against, kind of in order to take down the New Deal. The crisis of the 1970s was an opportunity for them to take down the New Deal and to get rid of the, all of this welfare state liberalism and all of that kind of stuff, right? So the Chamber of Commerce, quintuples in size over the course of the 1970s. The Business Roundtable is organized explicitly to be like, we are providing a voice for business as a class, not for individual businesses, not for like this guy wants a tax break and this guy wants help on exports. No, this is the interests of business as a class. That's like the entire idea behind the Business Roundtable organizing. And they win. right? They defeat tons of really progressive legislation in Jimmy Carter's term, right? Like, probably the one that listeners of Jacobin Radio might be familiar with is the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment Act, right? Which was the idea that the government was going to guarantee full employment. That act passes, but business waters it down so much that it's basically completely meaningless. So there's so business organizes and wins, but once business wins, the conditions for business unity are no longer there, right? That external enemy that business unifies to fight is defeated. And once Reagan gets in the White House, you have like business groups are reporting like, well, all our people are saying like, well, we got Reagan in the White House. Why do we need to keep paying dues to you for? And so the business organizations really start to fall apart and decay in the 80s and 90s. That's not to say that they're like, they're losing, right? Like they're like losing important political fights. No, business is so dominant that that they're not losing important political fights, but their ability to organize, to cohere a class-wide perspective among business, that's clearly decaying. And so in the late 90s, you start to see both the Business Roundtable and the Chamber of Commerce really acting in the most kind of provincial, narrow-minded interests of capital. So like the Chamber of Commerce, its business model becomes, you pay us money, and since we're a business association, we don't have to report the money that you're paying us to like the Federal Election Commission or anything like that. And we'll lobby on your behalf for things that if you lobbied for them as a business might look bad for you, right? So like it goes to bat for the tobacco companies in the late 1990s, and the tobacco companies' image is absolutely terrible. And the Chamber of Commerce plays a big role in like getting favorable export provisions so that tobacco companies can start exporting more and more outside the United States to the rest of the world, right? Again, like if the tobacco companies are lobbying for that, it doesn't look great, right? But if they're giving their money to the Chamber of Commerce, the tobacco companies can say, well, it's great that like we're very happy that Congress decided to give us these export incentives, but we didn't press for them ourselves, And that's very explicitly the Chamber of Commerce's model. It's about as far from class-wide business organizing as you can get. But you can see how this kind of model of organizing fits in really well with the radicalized Republican Party, because the Republican Party is always going to defend kind of the meanest, most sectional interests of capital, right? When capital's like, we want judges on the bench who are going to declare labor unions illegal, right? Like the Republican Party is happy to give them that, right? They're happy to fight for tax breaks for them, right? And so this decoherence of American capital, and they're kind of only looking out for their shortest term interests, is very compatible with the Republican Party shifting further and further and further to the right, And it also means that even the sections of capital that are concerned about this and are like, this maybe seems like not such a great thing, it seems like it could threaten business stability, they are not organized in such a fashion that they can do anything to kind of reverse or halt that slide.
I want to quickly follow up on that, because this was a really interesting part of your article. So, as you just pointed out, the Republicans, of course, are the party of big business in many ways. I think we all understand that. But you have a line in your article where you say something like, the GOP has embraced politics that actually run directly counter to the preferences of American capital. That is so interesting. You obviously tease that out in your article. Can you just, for the audience, give some examples of how this has happened over the last decade? Like, in what ways have the GOP's policies run counter to capital? And then can you elaborate a little bit on why this is happening? You were starting to touch on it, but what's going on here?
Yeah, so there's lots of examples. The government shutdowns are a really good example, because government shutdowns, most government shutdowns of the last 30 years have been basically a result of Republican intransigence. And government shutdowns are really bad for the economy, right? Like, money stops going into federal workers' pockets when the government shuts down, and those, lots of businesses depend on federal workers spending money. And also government services become unpredictable and erratic. For example, the Securities and Exchange Commission stops doing IPOs when the government is shut down, right? Because they can't, they're a federal office. And so things like that introduce lots of uncertainty into the business, into the climate. And businesses, capitalists hate uncertainty. They want to be able to predict everything. They want to be able to say, this is what quarter 2 profits will be. This is what quarter 3 profits will be. So government shutdowns are really terrible for business. They hate them. And so, like, you as business, you want certain things, right? You want tax breaks. You want unions to go down. But you're usually not willing to risk extensive uncertainty to get any of those things. And the Republicans are, right? The Republicans are willing to risk that stuff. So for big sectors of American business, that's, that's profoundly troubling behavior by the Republicans. There's other instances too. I mean, Republican intransigence on immigration is not in the interests of most of American business. Most of American business wants some kind of immigration reform, right? They don't want all the immigrants kicked out, and they don't want all the doors closed. The move to repeal Obamacare, right? Like, American health insurance companies fought against Obamacare, but once Obamacare is in, you have a whole series of interests that converge around it, right? Like, there's all this Medicaid funding going out that a lot of hospitals depend on, for example, right? The medical records industries blows up as Obamacare requires electronic medical record, so big sectors of American business learn to live with Obamacare very, very quickly. And again, the move to get rid of it is like, what? Are these major policies just going to whiplash back and forth between administrations like this? Again, lots of uncertainty. So yeah, there's lots of policies. And the biggest one of all is probably threatening not to pay the federal debt, right? To stop paying the debt. Because treasury bonds, which is, what the federal debt is paid on, are like the cornerstone of the world financial system, literally. Like the entire world financial system would be at risk of crumbling if the United States stopped paying out treasury bonds. So yeah, it's virtually no sector of American business has any interest in that. And yet the Republicans have shown themselves very willing to allow that to happen through pure intransigence and negligence,
But I don't think that you argue that, it's just that the Republicans are now these hardened culture warriors that, they're going to let the interests of capital fall by the wayside because they're too busy, whipping their base on these cultural issues. Like, what is actually going on?
So yeah, the issue is that the decoherence of capital has itself meant that you have sections of capital that are like, yeah, let's go for it. We want pure intransigence, right? You don't have that kind of class-wide discipline of capital. Instead, you have some sectors of capital, like the ones that support the Tea Party, which are, extraordinarily well-funded. It's not just like the Koch brothers and like a few cranks, right? The amount of money being raised makes that very clear. So you have sectors of American capital that are like, yeah, we think what's best for us is complete war on the welfare state at any cost, right? And so we're going to back the Republicans that do that. Then you have lots of other sections of American capital, including, like some of the representatives of the largest companies who are like, this is insane, right? Like you guys are completely insane. And so you've had this battle in the Republican Party between the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable versus like Americans for Prosperity and Freedom Works, the kind of Tea Party things. They're different wings of American capital that are at war with each other in the Republican Party.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and it's very well illustrated through your kind of exploration of Donald Trump's rise to power. I was listening, not by choice, I was driving, and this came on the radio, but there was an interview with George Will. And he was talking about how I just have to defend myself against seeming like I'm a fan of his.
It's your car's fault.
But he was talking about how he thinks the biggest flaw with the Democrats is that they are always pushing for bloated spending, right? And they're forcing the Republicans' hand, essentially making the Republicans threaten to destroy the global economy, right? So that they don't go out of hand, like feeding children in preschools. And he said the problem with the Republicans is that Republicans need to return to being the party of traditional Republican values rather than the party of Trump. But one interesting thing that you showed is that this kind of insurgent movement isn't new. And the Republican Party is constantly kind of realigning and redefining itself and folding in these insurgent movements. You showed this with the Tea Party, you showed this with Trump, and then that pulls certain aspects of it to the right, and then that kind of pulls on the knit of the fabric of the whole party until it's pulling everyone further to the right. So I was wondering if you could talk about that dynamic, particularly, how much of an anomaly was Trump in this regard, and is it really at odds with like Republican values being cohesive, or were they ever cohesive to begin with?
Yeah. I mean, so the way I characterize it in the article is that since the 80s, really, you see in the Republican Party this dance of insurgents and establishments, where you have these insurgents who want to pull the party to the right, and they often succeed, but their success often brings troubles that lead the establishment to be able to say, okay, we're going to be back in charge. Then the establishment has a crisis of its own, which sets the groundwork for a new round of insurgents to be like, we got to pull the party to the right even farther, right? And so you see that with Gingrich and Reagan, right? Gingrich in the 80s comes up being like, Reagan did not do enough. Reagan is not pulling the party far enough to the right. We need to be more extreme than Reagan. And, in 1994 with the Republican Revolution, when under Gingrich's leadership, the Republicans retake the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 odd years, they get that, right? The insurgents win. Gingrich, however, immediately goes into this budget battle with Bill Clinton, where he does a government shutdown, where he actually doesn't have the support because most Americans don't want to shut the government down in order to cut Medicare and Medicaid, which is what Gingrich wanted. And so Gingrich loses. I mean, Gingrich's star is tarnished almost immediately, right? Like by 1995, 1996, he is recognized as a loser, a political loser among the Republicans, right? Who'd been their star only a year before. So Bob Dole, very establishment candidate in 1996. Dole then loses to Clinton, which empowers the new round of insurgents who are kind of people who are even to the right of Gingrich, right? Like the people who Gingrich brings into office in 1994 are to the right of him, and they come to power. Now, what's interesting is that George Bush is not known for his political intellect, but he did accomplish the impressive task of forging Republican unity after the 1990s were kind of a decade of warfare between the conservatives and the moderates in the Republican Party. And Bush gets them both together in his administration because he has all these links to his father's administration, which was stocked with the moderates, but he's also a Christian conservative who likes, the lunatics like John Ashcroft, right? And so Bush manages to kind of unify them. But, after 2006, the Bush administration is shattered, right? The midterm elections that are overwhelmingly a verdict on the war in Iraq are produced one of the largest partisan swings in American history, and the Bush administration is done. And then the financial crisis in 2008 mean that merger that was formed under Bush is done, right? And kind of nobody knows what to do. The insurgents don't know what to do. The establishment doesn't know what to do. McCain is able to kind of rise to the top. It is a time for mavericks in 2008. And then, when Obama comes in, that creates the opportunity for the insurgency under the Tea Party, right? But the Tea Party can't really, the insurgents in the Republican Party, the people trying to drag the party farther to the right, have never been very good at producing presidential candidates. They've never done a good job of that. And so you get Mitt Romney in 2012, who's an establishment figure who loses, right? And I think a lot of people see Donald Trump as representative of like the insurgent right in the party, but I think that's to fundamentally misread his place. He comes from outside the party. By 2016, you've had you've had 7 years of Tea Party activism. Americans for Prosperity is a really well-funded group by that point. They have their own candidates. They wanted like Scott Walker or Ted Cruz. They did not want Donald Trump, right? And then you had the party establishment who was behind Jeb Bush, obviously, right? But Trump kind of canceled because there was this civil war in the Republican Party, they kind of canceled each other out, right? Their signals went unheard by the base because the party was so split. And Trump comes in running farther to the left on economics than Jeb Bush, right, promising to protect entitlements, and farther to the right on immigration than the Tea Partiers, right? So he's taking advantage of this situation in which the signals are scrambled to project his own uniquely scrambling presence in American politics. So I think it's important to see that Trump was not the candidate of the right in the Republican primaries. That's to misread the situation. He came from outside that, and the Tea Partiers and Americans for Prosperity did not like him at all, right? So the institutional forces of the right in American politics were not allied with Trumpism. Now, once Trump becomes president, everyone has to be allied with him, whether you're a moderate or not in the Republican Party, and so that changes things. But initially, he was not the figure of the right.
So this is admittedly slightly outside of the scope of your article, but I want to ask you about the Republicans' relationship to their base, because I think we've covered who their base is not. But I don't know if you know the old phrase, Republicans fear their base and Democrats despise theirs. I always love that phrase. I don't know if it's actually
never been more true than after the riots. It's
right, yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think that, as all political witticisms go, it's probably not completely accurate, or it doesn't 100% summarize what's going on. But I do think it's useful because on the one hand, of course, it kind of illustrates, establishment Democrats' unwillingness to actually fight for things like Medicare for all, which, are actually very popular with their base. And then on the Republican side, I suppose, that old phrase kind of gets at something that I've observed, which is that Republicans seem really willing to kind of incite culture war or kind of play to that wing of their base. So I guess the question for you is, is there any truth to those kinds of broad generalizations? And then a follow-up is, who are the Republicans' base?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there is some truth to it. I mean, and there's good social scientific research on the role of Republican talk radio and Fox News in stirring people up, and there's the people who study this have found in some cases Republican elites will be okay, we should really try and cut a deal on immigration. We're getting there's lots Americans for Prosperity and the Chamber of Commerce agree that they want immigration reform. No sector in the Republican Party is no sector of the kind of business institutions of the Republican Party is we want to cut off immigration. Yet that's a mainstream position among elected Republicans, and people have found people like Rush Limbaugh would listen to these Republican elites and be okay, well, we'll try and moderate it on immigration a little bit. We'll try and sell some of this immigration compromise stuff, and they get total pushback. Rush Limbaugh gets total pushback from his listeners and viewers, being "What are you talking about? That's a betrayal. You can never do that." So I think there is a degree of truth to this, that this Republican base is kind of riled up and able to kind of torpedo compromise and drive extremism in a way that the Democratic base isn't. I mean, I do think that part of the reason for that is this kind of divided elite among the Republican Party. I think that if you had a unified elite in the Republican Party, you wouldn't see the base able to play that role, because in American politics, voters fundamentally follow signals from party elites. Gathering information on the political system is very difficult and costly, and so people look for cognitive shortcuts from figures that they trust in their party on how to make sense of the situation. Voters in both parties do that. Among the Republicans, those signals have gotten so scrambled. And I think that the signals only make sense now in terms of culture war, So when Republicans are critical race theory in the classroom's a menace, all the Republican voters are yes, I understand that. But on any kind of actually salient policy point, their ability to deliver coherent signals to their base is basically non-existent. Even around Trump's tax cuts, they really didn't actually succeed in winning over large parts of their base to that. So yeah, I think that's what we see then is the culture war signals are running loud and clear, but actual policy, the Republican Party can't really make that in a consensual way anymore, outside of tax cuts, just these kind of very broad standbys. So yeah, and I think in terms of who the Republican base actually is, that's something that I want to expand on. If I turn this into a book, I definitely want to do a chapter on who is the Republican base. But just to be clear, there's plenty of workers in the Republican base, right? It's not the case that I'm saying that like there's no workers who vote Republican. It's not a clear majority of workers, right? It's not the case that workers as a whole are identified with the Republicans. Income in the United States is still correlated with voting Republican. The higher income you are overall, the more likely you are to vote Republican, right? So, and there's been some interesting research coming out in the last few years. One researcher found that it's really, if you look at how rich people are, not in the nationwide distribution of income, but in their county, right? In their county, are they rich or poor? And it's people who are locally rich who are really likely to vote Republican, right? So like, yeah, you might not be rich in Manhattan, but if you are rich in rural upstate New York, if you're more wealthy than all of your neighbors, then yeah, you're a lot more likely to vote Republican. So there's some interesting research coming out on that kind of stuff around class and the Republican Party that I think is really valuable, and hopefully there'll be a lot more of that kind of really serious research that doesn't just try and look for these kind of cultural stereotypes, but tries to look at like, okay, who actually is the Republican base in the United States.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.